Everybody started calling Jack the king of the comics, and at first he was embarrassed by it because Jack never thought of himself as being any better than anyone else. He was just another guy trying to make a buck, doing his best work, trying to bring home a paycheck every week. But eventually so many people were surrounding Jack and telling him that he was the king that finally he said, okay, all right, I'm the king, fine. Jack's only interest in comics was in telling the story. He didn't want to ink his own work because that wasn't involved with storytelling. All he cared about was that the story was told. He didn't even like drawing covers very much because if he was called upon to draw a cover, it was usually for a story he'd already finished, and he wasn't interested in that story anymore. He was interested in the next one. All he wanted to do was just to tell stories in visual form, and anything he could do that would make the story more interesting and would make the points clearer, he would do. And if it meant changing perspectives or changing a human anatomy or defying laws of physics of the page, he would do it if he thought it was advancing the story. All he really cared about was getting from the beginning of the story to the end of the story and taking the reader on a very interesting journey along that way. He didn't care if people said, oh, what neat pictures. That held no joy for him. He wanted them to say, what a great story. And he believed in impact. He believed in jolting the reader. He believed in making an impact of reaching out of the page and grabbing the reader and shaking him by the collar and slapping him upside the head. That's why he had so many characters leaping out. He did these forced perspectives because he just wanted to express what he was feeling and have you as the reader feel it as well. To Jack, he was doing an opera. He was doing a story that was larger than life, where everybody was singing Rigoletto the whole time. I think most people who met Jack were initially startled because they expected him to be this 6'4" god with broad shoulders, and Jack was a short, little, feisty guy with a thick New York accent, and when I met him, he was smoking cigars. So he didn't quite seem like the heroic type, and yet once you got to know him, you understood that there was an inner strength in him that was just as formidable as that of any character he drew. He was a very tough, fighting man who really believed in principles strongly. Jack grew up in a crummy part of New York, in an area where the kids didn't have much future, where there was a personal challenge to make something out of yourself, and you and your family were crammed into a little hovel of an apartment. It was a tough neighborhood, and he used to tell these stories about the kids in the neighborhood challenging each other to fights. Later on, this turned up in the Fantastic Four as the Yancey Street Gang. And everybody had to kick in. At a very early age, Jack was made aware that he had to bring home money to support the family.
He had to help his parents and work, and he was always drawing, and I guess his parents probably wanted him to go in another direction. But he obviously had some talent and, realized he could make a living out of it at a very young age. But I think he always had it in the back of his mind. That's how he started. And I think that's what kind of, kept him, as humble as he was, too, because he started, he worked his way up and he worked really hard. So, that definitely has a big influence on you.
Jack was born Jacob Kurtzberg, and he was very proud of being Jewish. He didn't change his name to hide that. It was just that when he started out in the business, everybody was putting pseudonyms on their work, and he signed all his early stories with different names. And eventually, the work that was signed Jack Kirby seemed to be what was catching on, and that became the name he was known on. Everybody says Jack was one of the fastest artists in the business, and that was true. He was also, though, one of the most prolific artists because of the hours he worked, and that should not be discounted. He would go to the drawing board around noon every day, and he would sit there around the clock, finishing maybe at 3 or 4 in the morning, pausing for a dinner break and maybe to catch a TV show or to go outside and smoke a cigar or something. But he would put in a minimum of 12 hours a day, if not longer, and he would just go from page to page to page.
His mind was always on his work. You can see it. I mean, he like everyday normal things that, that we do, my mother pretty much did for him. So basically he spent most of his time, you could see him just thinking. You could see wheels almost turning in his head, ideas, and that's all he concentrated on.
Jack Kirby was a two-person operation. He met Rosalind Kirby when he was doing Captain America originally in the 40s. They were inseparable thereafter. She was his protector, his chauffeur, his confidant, his advisor. She also took him away from the board. She used to tell these stories of how in the early days of Marvel, when Jack was drawing 5 books a month, which is not humanly possible, she would wake up at 7 in the morning and realize Jack had never joined her in bed. And she would go into his shuffle into the room where he was drawing and drag him physically away from the board and say, "You've got to sleep. You must sleep." And she would tuck him into bed, go to sleep, and she'd wake up around 10 or 11 and find that Jack was back at the drawing board. Jack kind of drew from the gut. He didn't really philosophize much before he sat down and did his work. If you said to him, draw a Western, he would just sit down and start drawing a Western. If you said to him, draw a superhero story, he'd sit down and start drawing a superhero story without a lot of premeditation. But he worked a lot like an improvisational actor who has all these experiences and he assembles them on the fly without really being conscious of what he's doing. It just comes out. It's all created at